طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هاي المحاضرة مقدمة ل lecture 4 إن شاء الله حنشرح فيها عن ال organs and tissues of the immune system. هاي المحاضرة بتعني إنه أو بتهمنا في شغلة إنه إحنا حكينا عن ال immune system بشكل عام، حكينا عن ال cells، حكينا عن ال B cells، حكينا عن T cells أو بشكل عام ال lymphocytes, but we didn't mention how they are produced and where they are produced. Now we have something called the primary and secondary lymphoid organs, and they are the organs that are responsible for the production and maturation of lymphocytes. Now primary and secondary lymphoid organs, the immune system is made up of distinct compartments, which is the primary and secondary organs. The organs and tissues which are interconnected by the blood and lymphatic vessels. Now, this network comprises those organs and tissues in which lymphocytes are produced. So, those organs produce lymphocytes. Okay, so the lymphatic vessels drain into the thoracic duct, and the thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. Now, primary lymphoid organs. Now, primary lymphoid organs are the bone marrow and the thymus, and we're going to talk about them separately. Now, those organs come into contact with foreign antigens, and they are clonally expanded. And why do we need the cloning process? Because when I make when I make cloning, what will happen that I will increase number of cells. Then what will happen? If I increase number of cells, I will increase number of the receptors in the cells. Then more receptors, more antigens that will bind to it. So uh, uh, yes, okay. So those organs come into contact with foreign antigens and they are clonally expanded and they mature into what? Effector cells. And the effector cells, the secondary lymphoid organs, as we see here. Okay, so bone marrow and thymus, primary lymphoid organs, considered to be primary lymphoid organs, they will make naive T and B cells. And what do we mean by naive? Meaning that they are immature. Then they will go to the secondary lymphoid organs for maturation to be effector T and B cells. Now, primary lymphoid organs in the embryonic period. Now, lymphocytes are produced in different stages in our life and in different places. Sorry. Lymphocytes during the embryonic period are initially produced by the yolk sac, okay? Then fetal liver and spleen, and finally the bone marrow and the thymus, so as the primary lymphoid organs. Now, primary lymphoid organs in adults, and they are mainly two, the thymus, which will make T cells, and the bone marrow, which will make the B cells. Now, when a baby is born, his lymphocytes are naive, knows nothing, yani innocent, immature. Then the lymphocytes will meet the antigenic counterpart. Then the lymphocytes, okay, the minute the baby is born, he starts getting exposed to what? To foreign antigens. So the lymphocytes are activated and memory cells are produced. And the baby starts to build his own memory cells. Now let's start with the bone marrow. Now bone marrow is the major hematopoietic organ in humans, and all blood cells types, including immature T cells, are generated in the bone marrow. Now, T cells actually is generated or produced by the bone marrow, but then it will migrate to the thymus. Now, B cells generation. B cells progenitors, or progenitors meaning that stem cells, الأصل, will be developed to immature B cells, and this process occurs in the bone marrow. Occurs in the radial direction toward the center of the bone. Now, what will happen to the immature B cells? Okay. Now, immature So B cells generation, we have B cells generate progenitors or the stem cell of the B cells. Now what will happen? Those stem cells will be developed to immature B cells, and this process occurs in the bone marrow, occurs in the radial direction toward the center of the bone. Now what will happen to the immature T cells? Now, they are, as we mentioned, they are produced in the bone marrow and migrate to the thymus to complete maturation. Now, we have a process that we are familiar with, which is the hematopoiesis. That the hematopoiesis is facilitated in the bone marrow by a mixture of cells that provide a surface of growth factors and cytokines. Both are essential for the development of various blood cell types. Now, what we mean by hematopoiesis, meaning that hematopoiesis, we are producing blood cells. Now, it is facilitated in the bone marrow by a mixture of cells that provide source of growth factors and cytokines. So, growth factors and cytokines will provide uh, 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 the um, provide a good environment for hematopoiesis to occur in the bone marrow in order to develop the various blood cell types. Now, what we have in here the reticular stroma, and the reticular stroma uh, is a mixture, okay, of extracellular matrix molecules made of macrophages, adipocytes, and adipocytes is particularly important in B lymphocyte development, supplying cytokines and other molecules that are critical to the development of mature B cells. So why we need reticular stroma before we need reticular stroma? Because they are made of macrophages and adipocytes that are particularly important in B lymphocyte development and production and maturation of B cells. Right. Now this picture shows the trabecular bone. Here we see the bone trabecular. What do you mean by bony trabecular bone؟ يعني اللي هو ايش؟ spongy bone, where the bone marrow is located. Now, and we have the hematopoietic tissue that help in the development of the blood cells. Okay, so this is the bone marrow. As we mentioned, the bone marrow is the major hematopoietic organ because the hematopoiesis process occurs in the bone marrow in the spongy bone. What will happen in hematopoiesis process? Hematopoiesis, we need hematopoiesis to develop and produce various blood cell types, and this process is facilitated by mixture of cells that provide a source of growth factors and cytokines. Now, B cells generation, and as we mentioned, B cells, progenitors or stem cells, will be developed to immature B cells, and this process occurs in the bone marrow, occurs in a radial direction toward the center of the bone. And we mentioned immature T cells are also produced in the bone marrow and migrate to thymus to complete the maturation. We have something called the reticular stroma. It is a mixture of extracellular matrix molecules like macrophages and adipocytes. Why do we need this reticular stroma, or why do we need the macrophages and adipocytes in the reticular stroma? Because they are important in B lymphocyte development and supplying cytokines and other molecules that are critical to the development of the mature B cells. Okay, let's talk about the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is the second primary lymphoid organs in our body. As we know, the thymus gland is a bilobed organ found in the anterior mediastinum in the front of the in front of the heart, and it is developed from the third pharyngeal pouch. Okay, the thymus is the primary site of T cell development. See, primary site of T cell development, not primary site of T cell production. Okay, so T cells are produced in the bone marrow and development and the and maturation of the T cell will be in the thymus gland. The main role of the thymus is to select what? T cells. Now, T cells, how this selection happens. Now, we have something called the positive selection, and we will talk about it in a minute. Now, the main role of the thymus is to select T cells that are able to recognize self-major MHC complex. An MHC complex is a set of genes that code for cell surface proteins, and it is important in our immune system in order to recognize foreign molecules. And as we mentioned before, the T cells cannot recognize antigens without the help of the MHC complex. Now, thymus gland will be fully functional at birth. Okay, the thymus grows until puberty and then undergoes atrophy and dies. Okay, so thymus gland will be fully functional at birth. The thymus grows until puberty and then undergoes atrophy. What do you mean by atrophy? It meaning that it stops growing and then it dies. When it has completely fulfilled its function. Now we have something we have a disease called Di-George syndrome, which is a condition where babies are born without a thymus gland nor parathyroid gland. Both glands develop from the third pharyngeal pouch, leading to the lack of lymphocytes production and hypocalcemia. It is important to know what will happen in the Di-George syndrome. So Di-George syndrome is a condition where babies are born without a thymus gland or parathyroid gland. Now, what will lead and this leads to lack in the lymphocytes production, mainly in the T lymphocytes, and hypocalcemia. Therefore, severe immune compromise condition. Now, cellular organization of the thymus. The thymus has three zones. Okay, three main areas or zones. First of all, the subcapsular zone, then the subcapsular zone, and then we have the cortex, and then we have the medulla. Now, what will happen when we move from the subcapsular zone to the medulla? T cells are selected as they approach the medulla. How they are selected? They are selected, as we mentioned, they are selected in a way that they are able to recognize the self-major histocompatibility complex. Okay, fine. This figure shows the three main areas in the thymus. The first area, the subcapsular zone, contains the earliest progenitor cells. Okay, now T cell progenitors arriving from where? From the bone marrow. Okay, so it will a T lymphocyte or T cell will arrive in the subcapsular zone, and the subcapsular zone contains what? Contains the earliest progenitor stem cells or T cells. So they are large in numbers. Now what will happen next? They will enter the cortex zone. The cortex zone is densely packed area that contains developing what? T cells that are undergoing what? Selection. But what will happen in the medulla? The medulla contains fewer and mature medullary thymocytes. Okay? So they contain the T lymphocyte cells that have been survived from the selection process and about to be released to the peripheral tissues in order to effect and take its part in the immune system. Okay, so most T cell progenitors, more than 95, will die in the thymus through apoptosis. Now, as we mentioned, as we move from the subcapsular zone to the medulla, we are going in a process or a selection process, which is T cells go through something called the positive selection, and meaning that the T cells in the thymus will bind moderately to the MHC complex. and receive what? Survival signals in the cortex. So what will happen if the T cells binds to the MHC complex? It will receive survival signals and complete maturation. But if it didn't receive, or if it didn't bind to the MHC complex, it will not receive any survival signal, so it will die via apoptosis, and the opposite in the negative selection. Now, then both B and T cells will go to the lymphatic system and then to the blood to meet their antigenic counterpart. And if they do not meet their antigenic counterpart, they are going to die via apoptosis. Now, after that, B and T cells will go from primary lymphoid organs as they mature to the secondary lymphoid organs, battlegrounds, to take their place in the immune system. Lymphocytes are dispersed to almost all tissue sites. However, some sites such as eyes, مش كل الeyes, الcornea, brain, and testes do not have lymphoid cells and are said to be immunologically privileged. Okay? Fine. What do you mean by immunologically privileged? They do not have lymphoid cells. Now, what will happen if the baby was born without thymus? Now, he will not have T lymphocytes, so he will have something called the Di-George syndrome, as we mentioned before. Why? What will happen in the Di-George syndrome, as we mentioned, is the lack in the lymphocytes production and hypocalcemia. Okay, so if he born without a thymus, he will not have T lymphocytes, cell-mediated immunity, and he will be immunocompromised. So what do we mean by immunocompromised? That the weakness in the immune system. So we have something called the Di-George syndrome, and it is a disease that characterized by cellular T cell deficiency. Characteristic phases: congenital heart disease and hypocalcemia. هاي دائما بيسألوا عنها hypocalcemia دائما. طيب, secondary lymphoid organs. The human secondary lymphoid organs are generally considered to be the spleen, okay, and the lymph nodes, in addition to specialized mucosa associated lymphoid tissue mold that lines the respiratory, gastrointestinal, and reproductive tracts, and a cutaneous immune system is also present. So the secondary lymphoid organs are located in the spleen. لا عفوا are the secondary lymphoid organs are the spleen, lymph nodes, and the specialized mucosa associated lymphoid tissues. We find it in the respiratory, gastrointestinal, and reproductive tracts. Okay, lymphocytes lodge. Okay, lymphocytes lodge in the secondary lymphoid organs. Lymphocytes lodge in the secondary lymphoid organs, and they expand clonally on contact with the antigen appropriate for their specific antigen receptors. Okay, they also recirculate among these organs via the blood and lymphatic vessels. This lymphocyte recirculation or trafficking connects the various lymphoid compartments to create one system will be discussed later. هذا كله will be discussed later on. As the secondary lymphoid organs are the battlefields, and as we mentioned, that get enlarged when exposed to invaders. Now, bone marrow is the major hematopoietic organ in the humans. We were exposed to radiation, cytotoxic materials, drugs, heavy metals, toxic materials. It will cause bone marrow to shut down, resulting in deficiency in red blood cells. Why? Because hematopoiesis takes place in the bone marrow. And deficiency in red blood cells, white blood cell, lymphoid series, myeloid series, and platelets, and so on. All blood cells types, including immature T cells and progenitor stem cells, will be affected because they were produced in the bone marrow. هيك بنكون خلصنا، بس خلينا نراجع آخر صفحة. إذا قلنا the secondary lymphoid organs are considered to be the spleen, lymph nodes, and additional and mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue that lines the respiratory tract, gastrointestinal tract, reproductive tracts, and cutaneous immune system is also present in the skin. حكينا انه lymphocytes large ايش يعني large they stay in the secondary lymphoid organs and they expand when they comes in contact with the antigen appropriate for their specific antigen receptors. Now they also recirculate among these organs via the blood and lymphatic vessels to create one system, the lymphatic system. وقلنا secondary lymphoid organs are the battlefields fields that get enlarged when exposed to invaders. Bone marrow is the major hematopoietic organ in humans because hematopoiesis takes place in the bone marrow. If they were exposed to radiation, cytotoxic material, drugs, heavy metals, it would cause bone marrow shutdown. So when we shut down the bone marrow, we shut down the hematopoiesis process, resulting in deficiency in red blood cells, white blood cells, lymphoid series, myeloid series, and platelets, and so on. And all blood cell types, including immature T cells and progenitor stem cells, will be affected. يعطيكم العافية.